Chapter 4. Acquisition and Development, Incommensurable Validities.
Data has an annoying way of conforming itself to support whatever point of view we want it to support.
Clayton M. Christensen. There is no agreement as to what acquisition is, or even as to whether there should be a difference between the terms learning and acquisition, or whether we should talk about L2 development instead. For instance, somewhat unusually, in their book about cell A theories, Mitchell et al. 2019 substitute the term acquisition with learning, referring to the field as cell L, distancing themselves from Krashen's acquisition, learning distinction P2. Larson-Freeman 2015 proposed substituting acquisition for development, as in SLD, highlighting what in her opinion the word acquisition implies. But the learning process is not characterized by the implication that language is a commodity to be acquired, the assumption of a positivist finite process, implied by the participle acquired, the assumption of a one-way process that does not also affect the L1, among others. Indeed, the general use of the term acquisition seems to be due to tradition rather than a generalized preference for it. Should it be acquisition, learning, or development? What really is at stake here is not a superficial choice of words, but the nature of the process these three terms are trying to describe. So what happened, for example, between the time I could not understand or produce English as a child and a teenager, and this current time when I am able to live, socialize, work and write this book in English? This issue depends largely on the discussion in the previous section, on a tension between structure and usage communication, a tension that turns linguistic competence into an obscure and controversial term.
What counts as evidence of development?
For generativists, the word acquisition exclusively refers to how the learner builds a mental representation that governs grammar, while language use and communication are conceived as belonging to another level of observation, or another type of realm entirely. I would argue that grasping this general sentiment is key to understanding divisions in the field. This sentiment has been debated in SLA for over 30 years. See Larson-Freeman, 2007. It is a general idea that takes many shapes. For example, White 2020 argues,
usage does not necessarily accurately reflect knowledge or acquisition. Production data can result in an underestimation of an L2ER's overall linguistic competence.
P, emphasis added. Underestimation, yes, but also overestimation, as other generativist scholars in SLA have tried to emphasize that usage production is not evidence of acquisition. For example, Krashen 1982, with his monitor hypothesis, or Van Patten with his efforts to convince teachers that through drills and grammar practice, it may look like learners are producing correct language. But this is not evidence that language acquisition has occurred. For example, Van Patten, 2017, Wong and Van Patten, 2003. Following this further, although Rod Ellis is more of a cognitivist in the general, than a generativist in particular, he has nonetheless declared not to be a supporter of CDSD, on grounds that the theory focuses too much on language use. Ellis, 2021 billions. Further, in his recent historical account of the field, he has stressed,
if SLA is to constitute a coherent body of knowledge, the focus must be clearly on how people learn an L2, not just on how they use it in social settings.
Ellis AP emphasis in original, echoing Casper, who made a similar observation when the field went through its most recognizable period of the social turn. Debates over 2 decades ago.
Any theory of language acquisition has to make explicit what the conditions and mechanisms of learning are. Firth and Wagner do not address these questions. What they seem to call for are the socially situated studies of second language use.
P 310, emphasis in the original. As we can appreciate, although the issues at hand and the context of all the above quotes differ greatly, there is an overall theme that somehow use is not representative of pure, implicit, internally represented, actual language. This is not to say that these authors dismiss the role of use or communication in L2 acquisition. Rod Ellis has dedicated many books to the promotion of task-based language teaching, a pedagogical method that emphasizes purposeful communication. For example, Ellis, 2018, Ellis et al., 2020. Similarly, Bill Van Patten has written entire books with the intention to improve L2 teachers' understanding of communication. Van Patten 2015. However, at least for the case of Van Patten, the premise is perfectly clear.
Language and communication are not the same thing.
Van Patten 2017 p22. While perhaps no one in SLA would disagree with that statement, I would argue that properly contextualized, its connotations may be too great for other theorists. It would mean the development of a communicative competence is not part of acquisition but peripheral to it. It would follow then that the development of cultural sensitivities, the use and disuse of chunkified language or the refinement of pragmatic choices, all related to use, could not be considered part of language acquisition. Instead, they would be a kind of development in another realm. But is that development not language development? This notion of language as strictly grammatical may be problematic for a comprehensive theory of language. And in fact, this has been pointed out for many years by many people. For example, over 2 decades ago, Nick Ellis summarized the criticisms as
taking the uniquely human faculty of language and then studying it in isolation, divorced from semantics, the functions of language, and the other social, biological, experiential, and cognitive aspects of humankind.
Ellis 1933. As a consequence of approaching acquisition with such a notion of language, the evidence of L2 development for generativists needs to be restricted to how grammar production changes over time, which is assumed to inform us about changes in the mental representation of a language in the brain. Grammar production is external and visible data, but a mental representation of a language is most certainly internal and invisible, and this gap is a universal methodological limitation in SLA, which is tackled differently by different theories, and thus creates many problems and controversies. We must not forget our theories ultimately tell us what can be observable and what cannot. Thus, on the external visible front, generativist and cognitivist more generally claim, not all grammar production constitutes valid evidence. Researchers have to catch learners while using spontaneous speech, so that we know they are indeed tapping into their implicit, automatic, internalized, actual language. This in turn creates a problem of determining when production can be said to be spontaneous, or spontaneous enough, which would lead to claims at a more internal invisible mental level. A problem that Rod Ellis addressed through factor analysis, a quantitative method through which various tasks were statistically shown to tap into 2 different types of knowledge, one said to be implicit, and the other one, explicit. Ellis, 2005. This was a big breakthrough, but the problem has persisted. For instance, the disagreement between Pieneman 2015 and Landhoff and Zhang 2015, mentioned in Chapter 2, precisely revolved around this problem. When Zhang and Landhoff 2015 found no evidence of universally ordered development, Pieneman 2015 responded by arguing that the elicited imitation EI task they employed did not constitute spontaneous speech, and thus it did not tap into the relevant psycholinguistic mechanisms in order to claim that particular observation of grammatical production was valid. In their response, Landhoff and Zhang 2015 cited various studies to defend the idea that EI tasks can indeed assess linguistic competence. We should also remember, methods depend on theoretical assumptions. Deciding what taps into a hypothetical unobservable mostly implicit linguistic system, and what does not is indeed difficult and, as mentioned in previous sections, through the neurologically informed DP perspective, lexical knowledge is still claimed to be associated with the declarative memory system, Ullmann C. Not to mention development may be characterized by a complex interplay between systems, even when they do not physically connect in the brain. Ellis, 2019, D. Kaiser, 2017. There are also interesting determinations that have been discussed in the past, but have not led to productive agreement. Is there a trans-theoretical definition of explicit? Are utterances coming from the declarative system, not language? There are reasons to question just how valid it is to force the cognitivist formalist very distinctive understanding of spontaneous speech onto other theories, when the neurological research does not seem to align well with the assumption that proficiency is equal to an implicit or mostly implicit system, especially in its initial and intermediate stages where learners may be knowledgeable and competent in some ways, before effective proceduralization has taken place. Furthermore, another major challenge for generativists has been explaining why or how changes in the production of grammar take place, because this is not part of UG theory originally. As Lydia White writes,
the theory of parameter setting does not in fact provide a theory of language development, even though it is often seen as such. The concept of parameter resetting in L2 presupposes that some kind of change takes place in the interlanguage grammar, from the L1 parameter value to some other parameter value, e.g. the change from movement to plus movement. In consequence, interlanguage grammars at different points in time may be characterized in terms of different parameter settings. However, the precise mechanisms that lead to such grammar change are not part of the theory of UG. Rather, the theory needs to be augmented in various ways.
White, 2020 p27, emphasis added. As such, generativists can identify and describe changes in grammar production, but do not necessarily collectively provide an explanation of the actual mechanisms involved in such development. This information is quite counterintuitive, since for many years the existence of ordered developmental sequences, predominantly discussed in generative terms, was considered one of the strongest facts about second language acquisition. Ellis, 2015, p13. This is another issue where the gap between the visible and the invisible creates problems. We cannot observe the mechanisms of the mind, and thus have to find ways to go around that problem. To be clear, processability theory PT does provide an explicit hypothesis for why stage-like changes take place, and it is captured in the name of the theory, learners must be able to process the input, that is, they must be developmentally ready to process it. Furthermore, there certainly is evidence for the existence of ordered developmental stages. However, this comes with caveats. For instance, it has been pointed out these trends are visible at the sample or population level, but variable at the intra- and inter-individual level. Larson-Freeman, 2011, p. 49. It would be unfair to state that generativists have been reluctant to address this variation, but rather they do seem to prioritize it in a different way, when compared to scholars from other theoretical orientations. In other words, this is interestingly another instance in which we need to decide whether the story is one of trends or one of variation, except in this case the problem does not seem to be axiological, but instead it revolves around methodology and incompatible theoretical assumptions. In the section below, I elaborate on this last claim.
Living in different worlds, trends versus variation.
Kuhn famously said scientists from different paradigms, in a way, lived in different worlds. This is because our assumptions shape our perceptions. This is visible in SLA and its pre-paradigmatic theories, where the same data is seen as defined by either I, solid trends that can confidently lead to conclusions, or B, misleading trends that hide variation. By C, misleading variation that is nothing but statistical noise, or D, evident variation that falsifies claims of trends. Let us examine these positions. Clearly, for some researchers, the story is about trends. For example, Bill Van Patten stated that before trying to understand SLA theories, all L2 teachers should know, as one of his proposed 7 facts of SLA, that acquisition is largely ordered, and generally nonlinear. Van Patten 2020, 281. However, although the statement seems to be quite carefully crafted, avoiding the controversy of whether orders are consistent, set or universal, SLA researchers from other theoretical orientations would in principle disagree with the wording of this statement, if not with the statement in its entirety. For example, Ortega 2014 states that development is always non-linear and dynamic. p. 200 matter. Jan Holstein stated,
There are, indeed, no facts in SLA, or in any other discipline, strictly speaking. Thus, the so-called 7 facts of SLA in Van Patten's book Theories in Second Language Acquisition should best be seen as presumed facts. Several of Van Patten's facts are only facts for those who adopt Chomsky's nativist view on language, language acquisition, and language evolution.
Jan Holstein, Personal Communication, December 29, 2023. I would argue we could recognize broadly 3 or 4 positions when it comes to ordered developmental stages. These positions vary according to theoretical orientations, as I have been insisting that evidence is not what empirical data shows, but what a theory indicates empirical data can show. At one end of the spectrum there is the position that in principle there should be no set universal order of developmental stages, and instead, development will be different in different contexts. This is the position SCT theorists hold, for example Johnson, 2004, Lantolf, et al., 2020. They are not dismissing the evidence of trends, as some have characterized, for example Thomas, 2005, they are scrutinizing it, because they see the same data through a different theoretical lens, where these trends do not or cannot be representative of actual development. Akin to how cognitivists claim through their theoretical lens that non-spontaneous speech does not or cannot be representative of actual language. Then we have other scholars in the middle of the spectrum. We find the position that clearly there are observations of trends in development across populations, but that they are framed through problematic assumptions, such as dismissing the possibility of potential subpopulations of learners within presupposed homogeneous groups, as well as the influence of the context of learning, considerable variation, the agency of learners in their own learning process, and the various factors relevant to cognition, such as salience, learned attention, prototypicality and frequency, that could lead to similar, yet non-universal stage-like states in learners. This is the position that usage-based and complexity theorists hold, for example Larson-Freeman 2010, Lowy and Verspoor 2015, Ellis 2019. Complexity theorists and their associates are not exaggerating the role of variation, they are highlighting it. And not because of some bias towards complexity, but because CDST's core ontological position, that in phenomena there is interconnectedness and change, is a pendulum-like response to a long tradition of research that looked at too few variables in very short periods of time, but somehow managed to propose sweeping generalizations. At the other end of the spectrum, there is the position that developmental stages not only exist, but they are both universal and innate. As we see above, this is clearly the position generativists take, and it is also the general notion that processability theorists hold, for example Pieneman and Lensing 2020. Although these two theories differ greatly regarding what can be universal and how much of the language faculty can depend on innate factors. Generativists do not dismiss the role of variability in absolute terms. It seems they have merely noticed the data has been consistent enough that they have gained confidence. This story is one about trends, that consistent, universal, ordered stages, regardless of U-shapes and variation, are there, and they are relevant or even central. For example, Van Patten et al. 2020 stated the source of both individual and group variation is not clear, p. 39, but assessed that the range of variation is not significant.
Learners do not seem to create completely idiosyncratic linguistic systems that do not resemble each other in some way.
When it comes to PT, we could say it is a special case. Not only does the theory very explicitly account for variation in grammatical production, but Pieneman 2015 actually has criticized dynamic systems theory for conceiving the nonlinearity of grammar in terms of accuracy. This is because in PT, grammatical variation is not seen in terms of accuracy, but through the lens of 6 proposed levels of sophistication in the mental processing of grammar. Variation, what some perhaps would colloquially call grammatical mistakes, through PT, is explained as alternative forms that fall into the same level of sophistication, Pieneman. In the context of SLA, where historically issues are framed in terms of generative linguistics and/or the attempt to go beyond them through functionalist understandings, this is quite an exotic theory. What PT proposes could be viewed as dissolving the dichotomy of trends versus variation, at least as far as grammar acquisition is concerned. But it could also be viewed as artificially forcing variation into a positivist 6-stage ladder. Is the disagreement empirical or theoretical? I would argue the disagreement is theoretical. Not only that, it is psychological. As to understand each theory's viewpoint on the same exact body of research, we have to entertain in our minds a completely different list of foundational assumptions, and use the same technical vocabulary in widely different ways. Additionally, even though the disagreement is psychological, it often leads to attempts to dispute the facts through more research. And of course this is a difficult endeavor considering partially if not completely incommensurable points of view. In other words, what we have here is a vicious cycle where debates have locked into a decades-long loop, or where we have learned to see fundamental disagreements as a natural and acceptable state. Further, the more technical and sophisticated a theory becomes, the more difficult it is to respond to it coming from a different theoretical background. The scope of the field keeps growing, but the problem is that it is growing apart, and this division destabilizes terminology and common ground.
Acquisition versus development, a division of labor?
Perhaps we should be careful to distinguish growth from fragmentation, because some argue there is no problem here. We can acknowledge cognitivists' use of the word acquisition and social approaches' use of development as an added layer. For example, Van Patten 2020b stated,
Different theories do different kinds of work.
p. 285, while Nick Ellis stated,
Taking the social turn does not entail restricting our research focus to the social.
Ellis 2019. I believe both statements may mislead some people. Firstly, to study acquisition and development is not to employ a division of labor. Cognitivists and socio-cognitivists do not study different things. They study the same exact process through clashing definitions of language, and a whole host of discordant foundational assumptions, which are in reality long unresolved disagreements. It is the underlying disagreements that result in differing scopes and layers, as opposed to differing layers being attended by different theories. Secondly, it is true that the usage-based cognitive orientation that Nick Ellis adopts can coexist with the wider framework of CDST. But that is because both theoretical frameworks are socio-cognitive. While UB researchers may not restrict their focus to the social, they take the social into consideration in every step of the way, and while they can, and do, freely refer to acquisition, learning and development as 3 synonymous terms, for example, Ellis and Wolff, 2015, the fact remains that in the field, there are inherent disagreements that led to both the bifurcation of learning and acquisition, and to the more recent uses of the term development as an umbrella term for any change in the learner's language. These disagreements may have been dissolved in the UB framework, but they are ongoing in the field at large, and they depend on how we decide to view, describe, qualify, and assess the available evidence. Regardless of whether there is an existing theory that presents these terms as non-contradictory, the problem is not the use of words, or the reconciliatory power of one specific theory, but the fragmentation of the field into different scientific communities that cannot communicate successfully.
Postures on L2 development, conversations or announcements.
I believe we should ask ourselves, how can the fragmentation be tackled when we do not even share the same terminology or assumptions? Asking researchers not to rush to hyper-technical terms in their own theories would be helpful, especially for scholars whose educational language is not Greek and Latin-based, as it seems this tends to be alienating for them. But this request would be unfair and risky, since we cannot really restrict any one theorist who may be on the verge of an important breakthrough. Instead, we can communicate and seek agreement as to what has to be explained from a panoramic and especially a synthetic or integrative perspective. It is extremely important to note that no one person could take on this challenge, because we all have our own biases. For example, some people may propose, SLA theories today need to explain why there is variability from one developmental stage to the next, see Holstein, AP. But this would declare a consensus, where there is none. As I have mentioned above, some researchers are still skeptical of the existence, or at the very least the true nature of developmental stages. I do not hold any theories in any sort of special status. I merely believe we cannot simply disregard SCT and CDST's multiple objections to ordered stage development, because this sends a confusing message to society that science is whatever you decide to believe and whatever theory you decide to worship. Perhaps a more neutral party could formulate, SLA theories today need to account for the possibility of consistently observing statistical trends that suggest ordered developmental stages. But would this be enough? It seems to me that the answer is no, because the resulting diversity of explanations and accounts would again end up being framed through incommensurable stances, thus only postponing the problem. This is why such determinations on the state of the science have to be reached through collaboration and dialogue. But not just any kind of dialogue, organized, sustained and revisable dialogue. There is a trans-theoretical conversation that is not taking place. What is development? Is it only grammatical, cognitive, or also functional, social? Should usage be dismissed in a theory of development because it is not immediately apparent that it perfectly falls in line with the idea of an implicit mental system? Or should we go the opposite way by dismissing the notion of an implicit mental system as the measuring bar for learning and development? I believe there is an illusion that the conversation is happening because of two main reasons. The first is that these issues have been debated for decades, and various proposals have been put forward, from joining the cognitivist views with the social ones through the expansion of the interaction hypothesis Mackey, 2014, to having an interpretivist turn, where we can work separately, and then have meta-theoretical discussions that make us question our biases, Talmy, 2014. The second reason we may feel the conversation is taking place is that all major theories account for, or have something to say about these questions. For example, the marriage between UB and CDST could be seen by some as an integrative framework that dissolves many problematic dichotomies and offers almost all-encompassing solutions to all debates. But even if one theory could indeed represent a perfect solution to these issues, this would be largely inconsequential in an environment where diverse thought collectives operate through a let's agree to disagree fashion. Thus, I argue that what we see is not a collective conversation, but more of a collective announcement of everyone's own positions, along with a pursuit to corroborate them through empirical means, which leads to findings that are only valued as strong evidence within a particular thought collective. This is a potentially everlasting problem, because if validity depends on a given theory, efforts to falsify that theory through another incompatible one lead to a senseless endeavor. While adopting the theory to be falsified in order to falsify, it would be an admission of defeat from the very beginning. We could call this the validity problem, which can only be solved through efforts to devise agreed-upon commensurable research designs, along with pre-negotiated standards for the interpretation of results, and not through the growth of divergent, independent and incommensurable lines of research, which clearly only leads to incompatible interpretations. In other words, through this view the validity problem has a sociological component that entails social action is required for a solution, as opposed to a single theoretical proposal, either from an individual or a thought collective, that is put forward to provide all-encompassing solutions. Ordered development is, in my opinion, a perfect issue to exemplify the validity problem. If SCT and CDST theorists do not see the validity of ordered stage development studies through their theoretical lens, no matter how many times those studies get replicated or accumulated, they will not become a fact or even a challenging observation, they will merely be perceived as repeated invalidity. Similarly for PT theorists, no matter how much they are shown variation over time, they may be able to place it in one of their 6 stages, or account for it through some other theory-contained ad hoc explanation. At this point I should perhaps clarify that I do not mean to suggest the reason we need a conversation is because science is a democracy where every opinion counts, labeled as the egalitarian approach to scientific disagreement by Königsberg 2014, nor am I suggesting all theories and research on L2 development automatically have the same epistemic strength. Of course, ultimately theories need strong empirical findings to be regarded as epistemically strong, but as Oreskes 2021 points out, while the empirical dimension is critical,
Expertise is also communally organized. Objectivity arises from social practices of criticism and correction, most successfully in scientific communities that are diverse, non-defensive and self-critical.
Thus, I believe all theorists have incompatible, but good reasons to believe in or dismiss universal developmental stages, or to take a position in any SLA debate for that matter. because the problem is not with pluralism, but with the lack of sustained epistemic coordination and with, I should add, the fact that the field's ever unsettled theoretical landscape renders expertise in SLA a very elusive concept, and empirical findings permanently inconclusive. Especially, as I discussed in the previous chapter, in the context where all lines of research are productive and self-reportedly successful. What is validity in SLA? And what is our contribution to the field, or to society at large, if we only work within our thought collective, consistently fail to convince researchers from other theories, and consistently fail to provide a coherent science for decision makers? We must turn our attention to the social actions that are needed to collectively decide how to arrive at commensurable theory testing designs, to negotiate what is objective and to give shape to a coherent standard of SLA expertise. In other words, we need to problematize commensurability, objectivity, and the forming of expertise, not as matters in need of a perfect proposal, but as issues which are dependent on sustained social action.
Summary of propositions in Chapter 4.
There is no scientific agreement as to what acquisition is, or whether we should talk about learning or development instead. Disagreements are caused by a tension between definitions of language, which in turn result in differing ideas of development. Generativists perceive acquisition as the building of an internal system that governs grammar, while many other approaches stress the role of usage, communication and culture as important factors for a theory of language acquisition. Often authors in SLA make statements about consensus when other authors clearly dispute the facts, and clearly there is no consensus. While some scholars believe ordered developmental stages are a fact, others offer more critical positions, while others provide alternative views for the very nature of development. There is a trans-theoretical conversation that is not being had about the nature of language development. I argue there is an illusion the conversation is happening, because of the presence of debates and proposals, but that in view of the lack of social action to find negotiated views and research designs, what we see is more of a collective announcement of individual points of view, rather than a conversation. I argue SLA has a validity problem, where clashing theories cannot be used to assess each other, rendering the prospect of standards of validity and expertise logically impossible. The validity problem cannot be solved through the growth of incommensurable lines of research, but rather through collaboration for the creation of commensurable research designs and pre-negotiated standards of interpretation. Science is not a democracy where all theories automatically have the same epistemic strength. Empirical evidence matters. However, in light of major theories disputing what can be valid empirical evidence, we must pay attention to the social factors that mediate commensurability, objectivity, and expertise. Ideally reimagining these concepts as products of collaborative and sustained social action.